What if the most dangerous person in the room wasn't the billionaire with enemies everywhere, but the quiet waitress refilling your water? And if, in the next 12 minutes, 5 trained killers seal the doors, guns drawn, and the only thing between you and certain death was her, would you even notice her before it was too late? Let me take you into that night. On a rainy Tuesday night in the heart of New York City, inside the velvet-draped walls of the Gilded Spoon, 5 men walked in to destroy a king. Their target, Julian Croft, a titan of industry whose net worth eclipsed the GDP of small nations. They were professionals, silent, swift, and utterly ruthless. They expected to encounter security, alarms, perhaps even police. What they didn't expect, what their meticulous planning could never have accounted for, was a quiet waitress clearing plates in the corner, a woman named Alara Vance. They saw a servant. They were about to meet a reckoning. This isn't a story about a robbery. It's the story of how one woman's forgotten past exploded into the present and, in the space of 12 minutes, changed the balance of power in the city that runs on it. The Gilded Spoon wasn't a place for the new money crowd who flaunted their wealth on social media. It was a relic, a sanctuary of old-world discretion, nestled on a quiet street in the Upper East Side. Its patrons were the kind of people whose names were whispered, not shouted, etched onto the brass plaques of university libraries and hospital wings. On this particular Tuesday, the rain outside painted shimmering, distorted portraits of the city on the restaurant's leaded glass windows. Inside, the atmosphere was one of muted elegance. Low, warm light glinted off polished silverware and crystal glasses. The air smelled of old leather, roasted duck, and money so old to have forgotten how to be loud. And through this carefully curated tranquility moved Vance, a ghost in a crisp black uniform. To the casual observer, Alara was perfectly unremarkable, and that was precisely her intention. At 27, she had mastered the art of invisibility. Her movements were economical and silent, her expression placid and neutral. She refilled water glasses before they were empty, cleared plates the moment a fork was laid to rest, and anticipated a patron's need for the check with an almost psychic intuition. She was, by all accounts, an exemplary waitress. But beneath the placid surface, Alara was a fortress of observation. She didn't just see patrons. She cataloged them. The man in booth 4, Mr. Abernathy, always fiddled with his wedding ring when he was lying to his dinner companion. The couple by the window, the Sinclairs, were on the verge of a messy divorce, evidenced by the millimeter of space they kept between their wine glasses. Alara noticed everything. The subtle shift in posture, the tightening of a jaw, the flicker of an eye. It was a skill honed not in hospitality school, but in the crucible of a past she kept locked away, buried deep beneath the practiced smiles and polite nods. Around her neck, tucked beneath her uniform, she wore a simple, worn silver locket on a thin chain. It was smooth to the touch from years of anxious habit, and it was the only piece of her old life she allowed herself to keep. At precisely 8:15 p.m., the bell above the heavy oak door chimed softly. Julian Croft entered, and a subtle shift occurred in the room's gravitational pull. Heads turned. Conversations paused for a half-second too long. Croft wasn't just wealthy. He was power personified. As CEO of Croft Enterprises, a sprawling global conglomerate with tentacles in everything from aerospace engineering to private military logistics, he was a man who moved markets with a single phone call. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, but there was a weariness in his sharp blue eyes that his immense fortune couldn't conceal. He wasn't flanked by a security detail, a fact that always surprised the staff. He came here alone, always on the second Tuesday of the month. He didn't come for the food, which was exquisite, or the service, which was flawless. He came for the memory. Your usual table, Mr. Croft? The maitre d', a man named Antoine with the demeanor of a retired diplomat, said with respectful nod. Alara watched as Croft was led to booth 7, a secluded alcove in the back. It was his late wife's favorite spot. Alara knew this not because she'd been told, but because she'd seen the way his gaze would sometimes drift to the empty seat opposite him, a flicker of profound loss in his otherwise guarded expression. She approached his table, her notepad in hand. "Good evening, Mr. Croft. Can I get you something to start with?" He didn't look up from the menu. though he already knew what he would order. A glass of the Macallan 25. Neat. His voice was a low baritone, accustomed to command. Of course, Elara said, her voice a soft, professional murmur. As she turned to leave, he spoke again, his voice softer this time. And Miss Vance. Elara paused, turning back. It was rare for him to use her name. He finally lifted his eyes to meet hers. They were piercing, analytical, as if he were assessing a hostile corporate takeover. Is the cocoa vin as good as it was last month? It was a simple question, but it was a test. It was his way of asking if the chef was the same, if the standards were slipping, if the world he tried to keep perfectly ordered was still holding its shape. Chef Du Bois is in fine form tonight, sir, she replied calmly. I believe you'll find it exceeds expectations. A flicker of something, approval, perhaps even a hint of a smile, crossed his lips before vanishing. Very well. Elara retreated towards the bar, her senses on high alert. Something felt different tonight. It wasn't Croft. He was a constant. It was a subtle charge in the air, a low hum of dissonance just beneath the surface of the restaurant's calm. She dismissed it as a byproduct of the storm outside, the city's perpetual tension seeping through the walls. She was wrong. At the bar, as she procured the ridiculously expensive scotch, she glanced at her reflection in the mirror behind the rows of glittering bottles. The face that looked back was a stranger's mask. Plain, unassuming, easily forgotten. No one would ever guess the violence that her hands were capable of. No one could see the memories that flickered behind her calm gray eyes. Memories of a life where observation wasn't a job skill, but a matter of survival. The silver locket felt suddenly cold against her skin. It was a reminder of a promise she had made to herself, a vow sealed in blood and tears a lifetime ago. She would never be a victim again. She would always be the one who saw the storm coming. But even she couldn't see the hurricane that was about to walk through the door. At 8:43 p.m., the chiming of the front doorbell sounded different. It wasn't the gentle announcement of a new patron, but sharp, discordant clang, as if the door had been opened with force rather than grace. 5 men entered. They didn't arrive together, but in a staggered, coordinated sequence that was almost balletic in its precision. The first 2 were unremarkable, dressed in dark, well-fitted suits that were just a little too functional for a place like the Gilded Spoon. They bypassed the maitre d's station without a word, one taking a position with a clear view of the entrance, the other moving fluidly toward the hallway leading to the restrooms, his eyes scanning the dining room. Antoine, the maitre d', opened his mouth to protest this breach of protocol, but sharp, almost imperceptible shake of the head from the first man silenced him. This was not a request. It was an occupation. The next 2 men were larger, their broad shoulders stretching the fabric of their jackets. Underneath, Elara could see the unmistakable bulge of body armor and the subtle but undeniable outline of a holstered weapon at their waists. They moved with the heavy, deliberate confidence of men who were intimately familiar with violence. One stood near the bar, his back to the wall, his gaze sweeping the room in a professional, systematic pattern. The other took up a post near the kitchen doors, effectively cutting off the staff's primary escape route. The patrons began to notice. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations faltered. The warm, convivial atmosphere of the restaurant evaporated in seconds, replaced by a cold, prickling fear. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with unspoken threat. Elara was behind the bar polishing a wine glass. Her hands didn't stop. The soft squeak of the cloth on crystal, the only normal sound in a room that had fallen deathly quiet. But her mind was racing, processing the scene with terrifying clarity. This wasn't a robbery. Robbers were loud, chaotic, and focused on the cash register. These men were silent, organized, and their focus was singular. Her eyes flicked from man to man, noting their position, their posture, their earpieces. They were creating a perimeter, a kill box, and at the center of it was Booth 7. If you were sitting there, would you recognize the pattern, or just feel the fear without understanding why? The 5th man entered. He was clearly the leader. He was of average height, with dark, slick-back hair and the sharp, predatory features of a hawk. He wore a bespoke Italian suit that probably cost more than Elara made in 3 months. He moved with a languid, almost arrogant grace, his eyes locking onto Julian Croft's table with chilling intensity. He smiled, a thin, cruel slash of a smile that didn't reach his cold, dark eyes. This was Marco Bellini, known in the circles that hired him as the Ghost, a specialist in extractions and corporate persuasion of the most brutal kind. Illyra's blood ran cold. She recognized the formation. It was a classic box and seal tactic, designed for maximum control and intimidation. She'd seen it diagrammed in worn-out training manuals. In a past life, she fought daily to forget. Her hand instinctively went to the locket beneath her shirt, the cool metal a familiar anchor in a rising sea of adrenaline. Marco glided toward booth 7, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. The two larger men began to move in concert, flanking him, their purpose now terrifyingly clear. Julian Croft had been observing the scene unfold in the reflection of his scotch glass. When Marco arrived at his table, Croft didn't look surprised, merely annoyed, as if a business meeting had been inconveniently interrupted. He took a slow sip of his drink before finally raising his eyes. "Bellini," Croft said, his voice laced with contempt. "I should have known he'd send a dog with a fancy collar. I assume you're not here to discuss the quality of the cocoa vin." Marco's smile widened. "Mr. Croft, always a pleasure. But my employer, Mr. Thorne, feels our last conversation was left unfinished. He's requested a more personal debriefing." He gestured vaguely to the room. "And he asked me to ensure you were fully focused on the discussion. No distractions." At that, one of the larger men pulled a compact suppressed pistol from his jacket. It wasn't aimed at anyone in particular, but its presence was a scream in the silent room. A woman at a nearby table gasped, a choked, terrified sound. Phones on the table. "Now," the man at the bar commanded, his voice a low growl that cut through the fear. Slowly, shakily, patrons began placing their cell phones on their white tablecloths. Illyra's mind was a supercomputer running 1,000 calculations a second. Kitchen door, blocked. Main entrance, controlled. 2 heavy enforcers. 2 scouts, 1 leader. Target, Croft. Objective, extraction, not assassination. Otherwise, he'd already be dead. She saw the man by the kitchen doors glance toward her, his eyes dismissive. She was part of the scenery, a waitress, a non-threat. It was the same mistake people had always made about her. It was a mistake she counted on. Marco leaned in closer to Croft, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We can do this the easy way, Julian, or the hard way. The hard way involves me redecorating this lovely establishment with the blood of these innocent people. The choice, as they say, is yours. You'll come with us, and you'll bring the Phoenix Drive." Croft's composure finally cracked. A flicker of genuine shock crossed his face at the mention of the Phoenix Drive. It was a small, almost imperceptible reaction, but Illyra saw it, and Marco saw it. "Ah!" Marco purred. "So you do have it on you. Excellent. That will save us so much time and unpleasantness." He snapped his fingers. The 2 large men moved to grab Croft. This was the moment, the point of no return. Illyra set the wine glass down on the bar with a soft, deliberate click. The sound was nothing. Yet, in the crushing silence, it was everything. The man at the bar turned his head towards the sound, his brow furrowed in annoyance. In that split second of distraction, Illyra Vance ceased to be a waitress. The invisible girl was gone. In her place stood something else entirely, something forged in pain, honed by discipline and utterly, terrifyingly capable. Her entire posture shifted. The subservient slump in her shoulders straightened into a line of coiled steel. Her placid expression became a mask of cold, lethal focus. Her world narrowed to threats, angles, and opportunities. The storm wasn't just outside anymore. It was in the room, and she was its epicenter. The first move was a symphony of brutal efficiency. It was not an act of panic, but a cold, calculated equation of violence. The enforcer at the bar, the one who had turned at the sound of the clicking glass, was the nearest threat and the one with the clearest line of sight to the most patrons. He had to be neutralized first. Illyra moved with a speed that defied belief. One moment she was behind the bar, the next she was flowing over it, a blur of black and white. She didn't vault it with athletic grace. She used it as a launching point. In her right hand, she now held a heavy, full bottle. She hadn't consciously grabbed it. Her body had simply registered it as the best available tool. The enforcer, whose name was Dmitri, had only a moment to register the impossible sight of the waitress coming at him through the air. His hand was already moving for his weapon, but he was a fraction of a second too late. Illyra's feet hit the floor, and she pivoted, all her momentum and body weight flowing into the arc of her swing. The bottle connected with the side of Dmitri's head with a sickening wet thump. It didn't shatter. The force of the impact was absorbed entirely by his skull. His eyes rolled back, and the 250-pound man collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut, slumping to the floor in a boneless heap. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. A collective gasp went through the restaurant. It was a sound of sheer, unadulterated shock. Marco Bellini, who was in the process of hauling a stunned Julian Croft to his feet, froze. His perfectly orchestrated operation had just been derailed by the help. What the hell? The second heavy enforcer, a man named Carlos positioned near the kitchen, barked, turning his attention and his weapon towards Illyra. This was the opening she had created. Illyra didn't wait. She kicked one of the heavy bar stools, sending it skittering across the polished floor directly into Carlos's path. He instinctively sidestepped to avoid it, a micro-correction that cost him a precious half-second and shifted his balance. It was all she needed. She lunged forward, staying low beneath the likely trajectory of his aim. She wasn't closing the distance to fight him. She was closing it to get to the kitchen. She slammed through the swinging double doors just as the first gunshot erupted. Crack! The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. A woman screamed. The bullet intended for Illyra splintered the wooden door frame where her head had been a moment before. Inside the stainless steel sanctuary of the kitchen, the staff, a chef, two sous chefs, and a dishwasher were huddled in a corner, eyes wide with terror. Out! Back door now! Illyra's voice was no longer the soft murmur of a waitress. It was a clipped, hard command that tolerated no argument. They scrambled to obey, fumbling with the lock on the heavy steel door that led to the back alley. Carlos, the enforcer, kicked the swinging doors open, his pistol held in a two-handed grip. Crazy bitch, you're dead. Illyra was already moving. On a prep counter was a cast-iron skillet, still hot from searing scallops. She grabbed it by the handle, the heat barely registering through her adrenaline-numbed senses, and threw it like a discus. Carlos, focused on scanning for a target, didn't expect a projectile from his left. The heavy skillet clipped him on the shoulder and wrist of his gun hand. He grunted in pain, his aim wavering as his wrist screamed in protest. That was her second window. As he fought to re-aim, Illyra lunged. She didn't attack his gun. She attacked his body. She drove her shoulder hard into his sternum, using his size against him, forcing him off balance. Her left hand shot out and clamped onto his gun wrist, not to disarm him, but to control the weapon's direction, pointing it toward the ceiling. Her right hand, balled into a tight fist, delivered 3 rapid, brutal strikes to his throat. He gagged, his eyes bulging, the air driven from his lungs. His grip on the gun loosened. Illyra twisted his wrist in a sharp, practiced motion that would have broken it had she applied a fraction more pressure. The gun clattered to the tiled floor. She didn't stop. She hooked her leg behind his, sweeping him backwards. He fell hard, his head connecting with the corner of a steel prep table with a sickening crack. He went limp. 2 down. Silence. The only sounds were the panicked breathing of the remaining staff as they finally got the back door open and spilled out into the rainy alley, and the distant, terrified whimpers from the dining room. Illyra stood for a single second in the center of the kitchen, breathing hard. Her heart was a jackhammer against her ribs. The locket on her chest felt white-hot. This was a part of herself she had tried to kill. The discipline, the violence, the cold, clear-headed focus in the midst of chaos. It was a legacy of her trainer, a man named Sergeant Kalin, who had beaten a single lesson into her until it was part of her DNA. Hesitation is death. Act. React. Control. She scooped the fallen pistol from the floor. Her hands knew the feel of it instantly. A Glock 19. She checked the magazine, nearly full. Her movements were fluid, ingrained, a muscle memory she hadn't accessed in 5 long years. Back in the dining room, Marco Bellini's frustration had curdled into white-hot fury. He shoved Julian Croft back into the booth. "Stay," he snarled, as if speaking to a dog. The 2 remaining scouts, whose names were Anton and Luca, had drawn their weapons and were now advancing cautiously on the kitchen doors, their movements jerky and uncertain. They were scouts, observers, not frontline brawlers. They were out of their depth. "What is she?" Anton whispered, his eyes wide. "Doesn't matter," Marco hissed into his earpiece. "Subdue her now. Use of force is authorized. I want her on the floor." Ilera heard the whisper of their shoes on the carpet outside the kitchen doors. She knew they would be expecting her to come out firing, so she did the opposite. On the stove, a pot of water was at a rolling boil. She grabbed it with a dish towel, moved aside of the door, and waited. She slowed her breathing, listening. 1, 2 heartbeats. She kicked the door open with her foot and simultaneously hurled the pot of boiling water in a wide, sweeping arc. A scream of agony tore through the restaurant as the scalding water hit Luca full in the face and chest. He dropped his gun, clawing his skin, his professional demeanor incinerated by pure, unadulterated pain. Anton, spattered by the water but not directly hit, flinched back in shock. Ilera exploded from the doorway. She ignored the screaming man and drove straight for Anton, the Glock held low and tight to her body. He tried to bring his weapon to bear, but she was already inside his guard. She slammed the heavy base of the pistol's grip upwards into his chin. His head snapped back, teeth clicking together, and his world went black. He crumpled to the floor, 3 and 4 down. Now it was just Marco. Ilera pivoted, the gun now leveled, her stance perfect, her hand steady. She and Marco Bellini stood 20 feet apart, separated by a sea of overturned tables and terrified patrons huddled on the floor. Julian Croft watched from his booth, his face a mask of disbelief. Marco had his own weapon out, aimed directly at Croft's head. A stalemate. "Drop it," Marco said, his voice dangerously calm. The fury in his eyes banked to a cold, simmering coal. "Drop it now, or the billionaire gets a third eye." Ilera's gaze was unyielding. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger. "You walk out that door right now. You leave and you live," she said, her voice steady, devoid of fear. Marco laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, little girl. You think you're some kind of hero? You're a waitress. I am Marco Bellini. I have toppled governments for men like him." He gestured with his gun towards Croft. "I don't care if your name is Caesar," Ilera replied, her voice dropping to an icy whisper. "You brought your war into my house. You threatened my guests. And I am asking you, politely one last time to leave." For the first time, Marco saw her. He truly saw her. Not the uniform, not the servant. He saw the set of her shoulders, the unwavering focus in her eyes, the professional way she held her weapon. He saw a predator looking back at him. And in that moment, a sliver of doubt, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, lodged itself in his heart. Who was this woman? The stalemate stretched thin and brittle as glass. The air in the gilded spoon was thick with the scent of cordite, fear, and expensive perfume. Patrons were frozen, trapped between 2 armed professionals, their world of quiet luxury shattered. Marco Bellini held his gun steady on Julian Croft, but his eyes were locked on Ilera. His mind, trained in threat assessment, was struggling to categorize her. She wasn't law enforcement. Her movements were too raw, too efficient, lacking the procedural stiffness. She wasn't military. Her focus was on disabling, not killing. She was something else. Something he hadn't encountered. "You've made a serious miscalculation, Waitress," Marco said, his voice a low sneer. He was trying to reclaim control of the narrative, to reestablish his dominance. "Mr. Thorne pays very well for success, but he pays even better for loyalty. My men will be compensated for their inconvenience." Ilera didn't flinch. Her eyes darted for a fraction of a second, not away from him, but past him, to the large ornate mirror on the wall behind the bar. It gave her a distorted but crucial view of the main entrance. No sirens yet. No flashing lights. Someone must have called 911, but in the gridlock chaos of a rainy Manhattan night, response time was a variable she couldn't count on. It was still just them. "This doesn't have to end with anyone else getting hurt," she said, her tone level. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of fact, an offer and off-ramp he was too proud to take. Croft, who had been watching this exchange with a mixture of terror and utter astonishment, slowly began to push himself up from the booth. He was a man accustomed to being the primary actor in any room, and his instincts were screaming at him to do something. "Stay down." Illyria and Marco snapped in unison, their heads whipped toward Croft. And in that shared moment of distraction, the dynamic shifted. It was the opening Marco had been waiting for. He wasn't just going to shoot Croft. That would be a failure of his mission. His mission was to extract Croft and the drive. So instead of pulling the trigger on the billionaire, he fired at the floor just in front of the booth. Bang! The shot was thunderous, a concussive blast that ripped through the quiet. Wood chips exploded from the antique flooring. Croft flinched back violently, crashing back into the velvet cushions. The shot served its purpose. It was a diversion, a sensory overload. As Illyria's eyes instinctively flickered towards the sound and motion, Marco moved. He didn't run at her. He dove sideways behind a heavy, overturned oak table, using it for cover. He was a professional. He knew the value of hardcover. "You're good," he called out, his voice slightly muffled by the wood. "I'll give you that. But you're one person. I have nothing but time." Illyria's mind was working. He was right. In a prolonged siege, she was at a disadvantage. She had to end this now. She began to move, not towards him, but away, using the line of booths as cover, circling toward the restaurant's main floor. It became a deadly game of cat and mouse among the ruins of fine dining. "Who trained you?" Marco called out, his voice probing, trying to get a read on her. "Mossad? The agency? You're no common soldier." Illyria remained silent. She didn't want him to hear her voice to pinpoint her location. She moved like smoke, her soft-soled work shoes making no sound. She passed a table where a terrified couple was huddled. The man was shielding the woman with his body. Illyria met his eyes for a split second, and in her gaze was not apology, but silent, steely promise. "Stay down. I'll handle this." She reached the maitre d' station near the front. On it was a heavy, solid bronze statue of a swan, a decorative piece that weighed at least 20 pounds. An idea, desperate and dangerous, began to form. Marco, meanwhile, was growing impatient. He couldn't see her. This invisibility unnerved him. He popped up from behind his table for a quick look. Nothing. He dropped back down. He was about to move to a new position when a flicker of movement caught his eye, not from the booths, but from the front window. It was a reflection. For a single, fatal second, he saw Illyria's form in the rain-streaked glass, standing near the front of the restaurant. He reacted instantly, rising up and firing 2 quick shots in that direction. Crack! Crack! The window shattered, exploding inwards in a shower of glass and rain. A gust of wind and city noise flooded the restaurant. But Illyria wasn't there. What he had seen was her throwing her black serving jacket over the bronze swan statue and holding it up for a second to create a misleading reflection. It was a classic misdirection play. While he was firing at the phantom, she was sprinting, low and fast, directly at his position from the side. Marco realized his mistake the moment he pulled the trigger. He spun around, trying to acquire his new target, but she was already on him. She crashed into him with the force of a linebacker. They went down in a tangle of limbs, Marco's gun flying from his hand and skittering across the floor. Now it was primal. No guns, just skill and will. Marco was strong, his body corded with muscle from years of disciplined training. He rolled, trying to get on top, to use his weight advantage. But Illyria was a whirlwind to control violence. She wasn't trying to overpower him. She was systematically dismantling him. An elbow strike, hard and sharp to his floating ribs. He gasped, the wind knocked out of him. The heel of her hand driving up into the bridge of his nose. He felt a crunch, and his eyes watered, blinding him with pain. He swung a wild, powerful fist, trying to connect with her head. She ducked under it, and as his arm passed over her, she locked it in a brutal joint lock, applying pressure to his elbow in a way it was never meant to bend. Marco screamed, a raw animal sound of agony, a stark contrast to his earlier suave demeanor. This was a pain that transcended training and discipline. The drive? Where is the drive? He gurgled, blood for his broken nose filling his mouth. Even in agony, he was focused on his mission. Elara ignored him. She increased the pressure on his arm, her face a mask of cold fury. This was for the terrified patrons. This was for the sanctity of a place she had for 5 years considered a refuge. This was for the promise she had made over her brother's grave. With a final, sickening pop, she dislocated his elbow. Marco's scream died in his throat, replaced by a choked, ragged sob of pain. He collapsed, his body trembling. All the fight gone out of him. He was broken. Elara stood up, breathing heavily. She looked down at the man who had brought chaos into her world, his face a mess of blood and tears, his expensive suit ruined. She felt no pity, only a grim, weary satisfaction. She scanned the room. The remaining 4 men were down, either unconscious or incapacitated. The patrons were still huddled, watching her with a mixture of terror and awe. And in booth 7, Julian Croft was slowly getting to his feet, his face pale, his blue eyes fixed on her with an expression she couldn't begin to decipher. The fight was over. The violence had ended. But for Elara Vance, the true battle was just beginning. Because as she looked from the defeated Marco to the bewildered billionaire, a name echoed in her memory. A name Marco had spoken that now changed everything. Mr. Thorne. Her blood ran cold, colder than it had at any point during the fight. Robert Thorne. She knew that name, and the knowledge of who he was and what he meant to her past sent a tremor of shock through her that was more debilitating than any punch or bullet could ever be. The immediate aftermath of the fight was a surreal tableau. The sounds of the city, distant sirens now finally getting closer, poured into the shattered window, mixing with the soft sobs of few patrons and the ragged, pained breathing of Marco Bellini. Elara stood in the center of the chaos she had created, the Glock still held loosely in her hand, though no longer aimed at anything. Her adrenaline was beginning to recede, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a familiar metallic tang of violence in her mouth. Her knuckles were scraped raw. A deep bruise was already forming on her cheek, where one of Marco's wild swings had grazed her, but she felt none of it. All she could feel was the seismic shock of that name, Robert Thorne. Her mind, which had been a marvel of tactical clarity just moments before, was now a maelstrom of conflicting memories. She saw a dusty, underfunded community center in a rough part of Brooklyn. She saw a gaggle of scared, angry kids, herself among them, lost after the senseless death of her older brother David, who was stabbed over a $20 debt. And she saw a kind, soft-spoken man with graying temples and gentle eyes who had shown up one day like an angel, Robert Thorne. He wasn't just a benefactor. He was a savior. He had used his own money to renovate the center, to build a new boxing gym, to hire counselors. He had personally funded the self-defense program, the one taught by the grizzled and relentless Sergeant Kalin, a former Special Forces operative Thorne had hired. Thorne had seen the raw, unfocused rage in a 16-year-old Elara and had steered her towards Kalin's class. Discipline, Elara, he had told her once, his voice kind. It turns anger into strength. It gives you control. He had given her an outlet. He had given her a future. The skills that just saved a billionaire's life. The skills that defined the most secret, most powerful part of her were a direct gift from the man who had sent these killers. The world tilted on its axis. She had just protected Julian Croft, a man whose name she only knew from the business pages, from the consequences of a war with Robert Thorne, the man who had in many ways saved her own life. The irony was a physical blow, knocking the wind from her lungs more effectively than any punch. "Miss Vance!" Julian Croft's voice cut through her reverie. He had moved from his booth and was standing a few feet away, his suit immaculate save for a dusting of plaster from a stray bullet. His face was a complex mask of shock, gratitude, and intense curiosity. He was looking at her not as a waitress, but as a puzzle he desperately needed to solve. "Are you all right?" he asked. Elara could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She looked at the groaning man on the floor. Marco Bellini, the ghost. He was Thorne's man. He worked for the man who had taught her never to be a victim, and she had just crippled him to protect. Who, exactly? He said they wanted the Phoenix Drive, Croft stated, his voice low and urgent, his eyes scanning the room, making sure no one was close enough to overhear. How could he know about that? Illyria finally found her voice, though it came out as a strained whisper. What is it? It's... Croft hesitated, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing her. It's a contingency plan. Data insurance. He was being evasive. The natural habitat of a man like him. Marco, lie on the floor cradling his ruined arm, let out a pained, wheezing laugh. Insurance. He spat, blood flecking his lips. He calls insurance. Thorne calls it theft. The intellectual property of a project that could have changed the world before this vulture. He glared at Croft, gutted his company, and stole it for himself. Illyria's eyes snapped back to Croft, a silent question burning in them. Croft's jaw tightened. Thorne's project was reckless, unstable. It would have destabilized the entire global financial market. I didn't steal it. I contained it. I did what was necessary to prevent a catastrophe. You did what was necessary to maintain your monopoly. Marco snarled. You ruined him. A good man. You left him with nothing. Every word from Marco was a hammer blow to the foundation of Illyria's world. A good man. She knew Robert Thorne was a good man. She was living proof of his goodness. He had taken nothing from her. He had given her everything. And this man, this Julian Croft, had destroyed him. She was protecting the villain of her own savior story. The silver locket beneath her shirt suddenly felt impossibly heavy, like a millstone around her neck. It contained a tiny, folded picture of her and her brother David, taken a week before he died. Thorne's community center was supposed to be his legacy. Everything she had learned, every hardship she had overcome, was in service of honoring that memory and paying back the kindness Thorne had shown her. And what had she just done? Her grip on the Glock loosened. The weight of it was suddenly unbearable. What was she defending? An insurance drive for a corporate predator? Croft saw the shift in her eyes. He saw the doubt, the conflict, the sudden, dangerous wavering of her allegiance. He was a master at reading people, and he knew he was losing her. Miss Vance, he said, his voice dropping, becoming more personal, more urgent. I don't know what that man, Thorne, was to you, but I can tell you this. The world is not a simple place of good men and bad men. It's a complex machine. Thorne wanted to burn it down, to build his utopia. I am trying to keep it running. The approaching sirens were louder now, a wailing crescendo just a block or two away. The window of opportunity was closing. Marco, seeing the same conflict in Illyria's face, tried to press his advantage. He's lying. He coughed, trying to push himself up with his good arm. Thorne, he wanted to level the playing field. Give power back to people like you. Croft can't stand that. He needs his boot on the world's neck. Illyria looked from the bleeding messenger to the powerful tycoon. Both men were trying to claim the moral high ground from a valley of violence and greed. She was caught in the middle, the fulcrum of their war. Her past and her present had just collided with the force of a car crash, and she was standing in the wreckage holding a gun, with no idea which way to turn. The police would be here any second. They would see a waitress with a gun and a room full of bodies. They would see a billionaire witness. The story would be written for her. But in this moment, before the flashing lights painted the walls red and blue, the choice was still hers. Who was she? The loyal beneficiary of Robert Thorne's charity? Or the protector of the man he called his destroyer? Her hidden skill had changed everything. But now, a hidden truth threatened to undo it all. The wail of the sirens was almost on top of them, the rhythmic pulse of the sounds painting the shattered front window in flashes of red and blue. In a few seconds, the room would be flooded with uniforms, questions, and consequences. This fleeting moment was the last echo of Illyria's autonomy before the official world imposed its narrative. Julian Croft saw the indecision warring in her eyes and made a final desperate play. It wasn't a threat or a command, but a calculated appeal to the woman he had just witnessed. "Miss Vance," he said, the use of her first name a deliberate intimacy. "Whatever you believe about me or about Thorne, look around this room. These people," he gestured to the terrified patrons. "They don't care about the Phoenix Drive or corporate espionage. They were in the crossfire of a war they knew nothing about. You didn't save me. You saved them." His words struck a chord. Her gaze drifted from his face to the couple she had passed, who were now helping an elderly woman to her feet. She saw Antoine, the maitre d', quietly reassuring his staff. Croft was right. Her actions, born from a personal vow, had created a shield for everyone in the restaurant. Her loyalty wasn't to Croft or to the memory of Thorne. It was to the innocent. It was to the promise that no one in her presence would ever be a helpless victim again. The conflict in her eyes didn't vanish, but it sharpened into a new kind of resolve. It was no longer about choosing a side. It was about ending the conflict. She took 3 purposeful steps and stood over Marco Bellini. He flinched as her shadow fell over him. She crouched down, not with sympathy, but with an unnerving calm. "The drive," she said, her voice a low command. "Mr. Croft won't be leaving with you tonight, but your employer still wants his property. So you're going to give me a message for him." Marco stared at her, confused and wary. Croft watched his expression, a mixture of apprehension and fascination. What was she doing? What message? Marco rasped. "You tell Robert Thorne that the Phoenix Drive is now in the hands of a third party," Elara said, her voice cold and clear. "It is secure. It is no longer in play. If he or anyone else ever makes a move against Mr. Croft or anyone in this room again, the content of the drive will be released to every major news agency and financial regulator on the planet." Croft's eyes widened. She was bluffing. She didn't have the drive. Marco, however, didn't know that. He saw the conviction in her eyes. "You don't have it," he challenged weakly. Elara leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for him. "Your men are alive, battered and broken, but alive. I could have killed every single one of you. I chose not to. Do I seem like a person who bluffs? You tell him David's sister has it. He'll know what that means." The mention of her brother's name was a key, unlocking a new level of understanding for Marco. This wasn't random. This was personal. A ghost from Thorne's benevolent past had just become his greatest liability. He simply nodded, the fight truly and finally gone from him. Elara stood up and turned to face Croft. She held out the Glock, grip first. "I believe this is yours," she said, her tone professional, as if she were handing him a lost coat. Croft stared at the gun, then back at her face. He understood instantly what she had done. She hadn't chosen him. She had chosen neutrality. She had created a stalemate, mutually assured destruction that protected him far better than any bodyguard could. And in doing so, she had seized control of the entire situation. She now held the leverage over both him and Thorne. He didn't take the gun. The sounds of heavy boots were on the pavement outside. "The police will need to take that," he said quietly. "They'll have questions. A lot of them. Let my lawyers handle it. Don't say a word until they arrive." "I can handle my own questions," she replied, a hint of steel in her voice. He managed a small, wry smile. "Of course you can." He reached into his jacket, and for a heart-stopping moment, Elara tensed. But he wasn't reaching for a weapon. He pulled out a small, almost invisible object from a hidden pocket sewn into the lining of his suit. It was a minuscule data drive, no bigger than a thumbnail, shaped like a gold feather. The Phoenix Drive. Without a word, he pressed it into her hand. Elara's fingers closed around it. The warmth of his hand, the cold, hard reality of the object. It was an act of absolute, insane trust. Or perhaps the most calculated business decision of his life. He was placing his insurance in the hands of the only person who had proven she could defend it. He was moving his queen to the safest, most unpredictable square on the board. "You called it a third party," he said, his voice barely a whisper as the first police officers burst through the door, weapons drawn. "Now you are one." The police swarmed in a tide of blue uniforms and shouted commands. NYPD dropped the weapon, hands in the air. Slowly, deliberately, Ilara placed a Glock on a nearby table. She raised her empty hands, her right fist tightly clenched around the tiny drive that had caused all this chaos. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. She was no longer just Ilara Vance, the waitress. She was no longer just the ghost of Sergeant Kalen's training room. She was something new, forged in the crucible of that night. As the police secured the scene, placing the groaning henchman in cuffs and calling for medics, a detective approached her and Croft. Croft immediately took charge, his voice regaining its familiar tone of command, weaving a narrative of a robbery gone wrong, of a brave waitress who had defended herself and others. He was protecting her, spinning a story that would keep her out of prison cell. But Ilara knew the truth. This wasn't over. It was a new beginning. She had stepped out of the shadows and, in doing so, had placed herself at the center of a war between two powerful, ruthless men, one of whom had saved her life, the other whose life she had just saved. And in her hand, she held a weapon that could destroy them both. The choice was no longer about who to fight for, but what to build from the ashes. The days that followed were a carefully managed whirlwind. Julian Croft's legal team descended like a tactical unit, sanitizing the chaos at the Gilded Spoon into a palatable, heroic narrative for the police and the press. The official story was a thwarted robbery, and Ilara Vance was the brave waitress with a surprising knack for self-defense. The truth was buried under a mountain of paperwork and non-disclosure agreements. A week later, Ilara stood not in a police station, but in Julian Croft's office, a glass cage at the apex of the city. He was waiting by the window, a silhouette against the sprawling metropolis. "I owe you a debt that can't be repaid with money," he began, turning to face her. "Though you'll find a sum has been transferred to a private account that will ensure you have the freedom to do whatever you wish with your life." He paused, his gaze intense. "But I didn't bring you here for that. I'm not offering you a job as my bodyguard. A bodyguard reacts. I need someone who acts first." He gestured to the city below. "My empire has 1,000 enemies. Corporate rivals, political players, and men like Thorne. I fight them in boardrooms. But the rules are changing. I need a new department. One that operates in the gray spaces. Your department. You will build it from the ground up. You will answer only to me. Your mandate. Neutralize threats before they even have a name." It was an offer of immense power, a kingdom of shadows. Ilara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She had spent 5 years running from her skills, and now she was being asked to build a throne upon them. "I accept," she said, "on 2 conditions." Croft's eyebrow arched in surprise. "First," Ilara stated, her voice firm, "Robert Thorne is to be left alone. No retaliation from you or your company. The stalemate I created holds. He stays down and you let him stay there." It was a bold demand, protecting his enemy. After a moment of thought, Croft gave a single, sharp nod. "Done." "Second," she continued, her voice dropping, "I keep the Phoenix Drive." She held up the tiny feather-shaped device she had concealed since that night. "It doesn't belong to you or to him. It belongs to me. It's my leverage, Mr. Croft, to ensure the necessary actions your company takes don't cross a line I'm unwilling to defend." She was not asking to be his weapon, but to be his check and balance. For a long moment, the billionaire was silent, studying the woman before him. Then a slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a look of pure, unadulterated respect. He had expected a soldier, but he had found a strategist. "Welcome to Croft Enterprises, Miss Vance," he said, extending his hand. Ilara took it. As their hands clasped, a new contract was sealed high above the city. The waitress was a ghost, a story left behind in an empty restaurant. In her place stood the director of his most secret operations, a queen on a board her own making, forever guarding the line between protection and perdition.